The sound of a familiar voice can be so reassuring. I don't know how many of you all listen to WNYC, but those of you that do know that just about 10 days or so, Richard Hake, the host of Morning Edition, died suddenly, unexpectedly. He was 51 years old, in fine health. Richard had led the Morning Edition program for several decades, and this news of his death came as such a surprise that the radio station throughout this week has offered people a chance to call a particular number and to tell their story about the significance of Richard's hosting of that show for them, to create some sort of remembrance. And I remember listening to one particular woman's call, and she had a pretty heavy accent, and she started to cry in the middle of what she was saying on the voicemail machine. She said, "Richard, you were my first friend. You were the person that I heard first every single morning. And hearing your voice and the news that you delivered always gave me assurance and helped me get my day started right." Radio announcers with their voices bring to our attention the power of the voice, the significance of the voice, and the reassurance that can be offered with a voice. In our gospel lesson today, Jesus talks about being the good shepherd and says, "The sheep know my voice, and they respond to me," in essence, is what he says. But my question to us is, do we? Do we know the sound of the voice of the shepherd? This scripture is one that is suggested for funerals, one of 5 different gospel lessons that people often choose from. And the power, as you can well see in this particular passage, is the assurance that we are in the loving Father's arms, and that he holds us and gives us life abundant. I have every confidence that we can hear the voice of Jesus so clearly and recognize it so distinctly when we are in the silence of the grave. But I wonder, in the cacophony of the world in which we live, if we can find the voice of Jesus. This pandemic has altered the audio landscape. The familiar sounds of things that filled our calendars, such as work or vacation or gatherings, lessons, sports, even our to-do list, all of those has started to change. We would get texts and phone calls during the day and email alerts and Instagram and TikTok and Facebook updates. The thoughts in our heads would be interrupted only by people who we met in the office or at school or on the road or in line. We hurried to make dinner or order takeout or make reservations or clean the house or call people together for family time or get ready for work or to exercise. We ordered coffee online and food online and groceries online and household goods online so that we could save some time. We hurried and hurried and hurried so that we could save some time. We multitasked. We made phone calls while driving. We helped with homework while doing the laundry. We did family fun time with family agenda planning. Getting together, we combined with friends while making time to rest. We worked out while catching up on the news. Years ago, when talking with some young families about necessary improvements to our social media efforts, someone said, "We are hit by so many sounds and forms of communication that the church and our faith gets lost in it. We need the church to be louder." Well, guess what, folks? The audio landscape has indeed changed. Some of the sounds have dropped out completely. Other sounds have become distorted and don't offer the familiar consolation of life as we knew it to be, as we imagined that it should be. We may have even become surprised over these weeks to realize that what we thought was certain isn't so much. It's not as certain as we thought it to be. My dears, the only thing that is certain is the voice of Jesus, remaining true and clear and constant throughout all time, unmuffled and unchanged by the cacophony of the world. So how do we learn to hear the voice of Jesus? You'll be surprised, perhaps, to know it's a simple answer. We learn to hear the voice of Jesus in prayer. Last Sunday afternoon, I met with our young people, those that are involved with our Global Philanthropy Leaders Initiative, and shared with them some stories of a couple of people in poverty and the power of Jesus' voice to them in prayer. One woman shared her experience of attending to thousands of poor people. She was hired by her government to be an agent of caring for them, and the overwhelmingness of the requests and the needs that came before her. And she told a story particularly of a woman who needed some help, and the first thing this woman did was she went to God in prayer and centered herself in that space and asked God to give her some sense of direction. And she tells in her story that in a moment's time, a name came to her attention, and she decided she would simply call that person and share with them what she had before her. And the person, without even hesitating, said, "Yes, I will take care of that." There was another story of a person who himself was in poverty, actually had the disease of leprosy. He was diagnosed with it in his 20s, and as the years progressed, the disease came and took more and more of his physical features. In the photo, you can see that his face, the facial bones are distorted, and he is completely blind. And he tells of his own journey with this disease and how it has drawn him into prayer over and over and over again. And so you hear him talk about the voice of Jesus coming to him and how it's inspired him to be a voice of encouragement to others. And imagine my surprise in reading this story to come across a poem at the end that I had received via Google some 15 or 20 years ago. Someone had passed along to me through some email chain. And I have remembered that poem all these years, and I didn't know it was from this man. Prayer is what gives us insight into the voice of Jesus. When I've talked to people who've discovered this, they have said things to me like, it kind of sounds like my own voice, and I want to say, yes, it does. Because Jesus comes to us in the familiar, and what's more familiar to us than our own voice? It's the most familiar thing we have. Of course, we have to inquire of it and to see if that voice calls us into being more like Jesus. That's the test of that voice. But I can tell you, to each of these people that have come to discover it, they have found it as an invitation into love, into faith, and to hope, to living a life abundant, one that generates the good news. Yes, the voice of Jesus can only come to us in prayer. Now, for a good many of us, we go to prayer when we realize that we don't have anything else to turn to. It's like some bodily response to an incapability. We don't know what else to reach for. There's nothing handy, and so we cry out to God in prayer. And that is fine and good, but my question to you and to each of us is, what if we learn to go to prayer first? What if we go to prayer first anyway? This pandemic is showing us our poverty, our limitations as human beings. That yes, we can build our lives, but quickly they can fall apart. And so it calls us to remember again the one who created us, the one who gave us life, the one who calls forth life from us every single day. And this makes it possible for us to consider prayer. You might find that you are more open to praying during this time. And I imagine God saying to you, yes, please take it. Take this opportunity to be with me. I've been waiting for you. I've been wanting you. You probably know that I am a big lover of sheep. I have a photo that Jonathan's going to put on the screen now. I could go on and on about how much I love sheep. I just am so amazed at their creation, every bit of them. the wool that they generate every year and what can be done with wool, how they give milk and meat. And you can see in this photo that I am delighted to be holding this baby lamb. I want you to look on this picture for a moment and imagine my expression as God's expression with you. Imagine the delight that you see on my face as God's delight in holding you. And hear these words from our scriptures. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths simply for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I don't have to fear any evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, and these, my Lord, bring comfort to me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life as I dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. The shepherd is our way. And it's not just our way for our convenience or our consumption or our reception. It's our way so that we might show others the way too. There is a story in the Gospels, this same Gospel, Gospel of John, in which Peter encounters Jesus as the resurrected one. It's right at the very end of John's Gospel, chapter 21. And Jesus and Peter are out on the edge of the Sea of Galilee with some other disciples, and Jesus asks Peter if he will feed his sheep. He asks this of Peter in response to first his question of Peter, "Do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yes, Lord." And Jesus says, "Feed my sheep." This pandemic is making evident some of our social ills, ones perhaps that we didn't notice because we were so busy with our own activities. In the stripping away of so much of what we've always known, we're able better to hear Jesus' voice and to see the world that God sees all of the time. It is grievous to us to realize. Some of you know last week that I sent out an invitation for opportunities to become further aware of these social ills. And one of them was to participate or watch a webinar on the intersection of race and healthcare and the virus. 2 people from our congregation did join me in watching that webinar. And afterwards, each of them reached out and they expressed similar sentiments, saying, "I have been paying attention, and yet what I heard today expanded my understanding. I didn't realize the extent to which race and healthcare and economics were intertwined and tangled up. I didn't know how pervasive it was." And one person said to me, "Whitney, what can we do?" We do know about the effects of chronic stress and how it affects one's healthcare, one's health. You might consider for a moment the idea of stop and frisk. Perhaps your only experience of something like this has been going through the airport terminal and you were indicated as one who needed to step aside. And the person right there in the middle of everything, with their gloves on, was very careful and cautious about frisking you for anything that might be a threat to anyone else. But consider if this was your experience without such obviousness in the place of safety, without gloves, without any indication of what this could mean. Or perhaps consider if you watch something on YouTube or on the news about traffic violations and people who have been pulled over and then end up getting shot. Wouldn't you be afraid to then even be pulled over? This is how chronic stress plays a role in one's health. And we could go on and on. This is just the tip of the iceberg. But it calls us to say, oh my goodness, what do we need to pay attention to? And how is God asking us to respond to the brokenness in this world? Those that participated in the webinar last week will meet with me later on this week, and a few others as well, to start to bring us into a mindfulness of what God has already been mindful of. Because it is in love that we find the capacity to respond to that which overwhelms us. It's love that gives us the strength and the will to engage with the evils and the woes that we see. Another example of what can feel like a burden is our awareness of our environmental issues. And I heard just a news story last night in which someone commented on, what about all these plastic gloves and what about all of these plastic bags? And now we know about fossil fuels, and someone told me yesterday about a plague of locusts in some part of Africa. I didn't look up the news story. But I'm trying to illustrate for you, if I can, just in one day, the various news that we can have coming at us. And the question, how do we even respond to this? What do we even do? Again, it is love that gives us the strength to take the first of 500 steps. To do the work that we need to do, which we may not see come to completion. The thing about systemic racism and issues of the environment is that it affects all of us. None of us stand outside of these issues. Each of us is affected by them, whether we're cognizant of it or not. And our lack of awareness does not mean that we're on the safe side. It only means that we're unaware. Our lack of awareness means that we don't have insight. Some people would call it ignorance. Jesus calls it blindness, highlighting that we often rely on seeing to believe. And sometimes we refuse to see. Jesus also says, those with ears to hear, listen. And so I call us back to the end of John's Gospel, a passage of Scripture that if we rely on the lectionary, you won't hear for a couple of years. As I alluded to before, this is Jesus with his disciples on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. This is after his resurrection, when he sits down and eats with them fish that have been cooked over a stove, further indicating that his resurrection is in bodily form. And he says to Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Peter says to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time, Jesus said to Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." Jesus said to Peter a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him a third time, "Do you love me?" And Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." The Good Shepherd is the shepherd of us all. He calls us each by name. And listening to his voice, we know that he will lead us to the place of life where we will find sustenance and peace, even if we're in the midst of our enemies. That our heads will be anointed with oil and our cups will overflow in living the life that Christ has called us to live. Jesus said, "I have come that they might have life and might have it abundantly." Let this be a sign and an indicator to you, my friends, that no one can love you better than Jesus. No one can love you as much as you deserve. Only Jesus can love you as much as you deserve. And so as we reflect on the voice of our Good Shepherd, we open ourselves to hearing his voice more clearly in our lives during this particular time, being mindful of the things that weigh heavy on his heart, on his love for all of his sheep. And how is it that